Welcome back to another edition of Components Breakdown. Today I'm going to take a look at quite possibly my favorite game of 2011, or at least one of my favorites that I've had the chance to play thus far. Eclipse is an epic 2 to 6 player empire building game that places its players in control of interstellar civilizations who are competing for success by exploring new star systems, researching technologies, and building spaceships to wage war or defend themselves from other aggressive species. At its core, Eclipse is a wonderfully designed game of resource management that's interwoven itself with an innovative action selection process that requires its players to carefully and continually balance their choice of actions each and every turn. Because of this, each player's exponential growth and expansion in the galaxy creates higher upkeep costs for that player that must be paid, which in turn restrains civilizations from taking an unlimited amount of actions or becoming too dominant. What's excited me most about this game, though, are the many different paths to victory that players may take, which does require advanced planning according to the strengths and weaknesses of their chosen species, as well as their own individual playstyles. But yet there is more than enough flexibility in the game to allow deviations whenever a player's current situation outweighs their inherent strengths. There are a lot of smaller details in Eclipse as well, including the multiple ways that players can tinker and build their individual ship designs and technological trees to their own liking. But what's important again is just how seamlessly all of these things have been included in the game, which reminds me of one of my favorite games of last year, which was Sid Meier's Civilization, which to this day I believe is a masterpiece in board game design. I could spend a lot of time on Eclipse here, but instead I'm going to show you just the basics of the gameplay, starting with the game's components and setup. Eclipse comes with over 900 total pieces and a robust 32-page rulebook, creating what may initially feel like a very complex or overly complicated game. But as I previously mentioned, don't let all these materials intimidate you, because inside you're finding an extremely well-organized and written set of rules that detail what is already a very simple game to understand and play. With so many different components in this game, though, let me go over just the most essential set of basic materials to get you started. To begin, each player will choose one of the 12 individual species in the game, all of which are color-coded and divided into 6 similar Terran and 6 unique alien races. Each of these races have their own set of characteristics and starting abilities, as well as a player board, starting hex, population markers, influence markers, ambassadors, star bases, colony ships, and starships, all of which are placed either on or off to the side of their player board. Speaking of the player board itself, these house the numerous different actions and choices that players make throughout the course of the game that pertain to the building of their own individual civilization, including all the production, resource management, ship modifications, and technologies that they have chosen to research. Looking at the board a little bit closer, we notice a few very key areas. First, at the top of each player's board, we have diagrams of the game's 4 different types of ships that can be built and used in both exploration and combat, all of which can be modified with the game's 17 different types of ship parts as the player so chooses, as long as they have researched the correct type of technology that allows them to upgrade those components, as well as having an energy source in those ships that provide them with enough power to be installed. When it comes to technology, there are 3 different types that are represented by 3 different rows on the player's board, all of which give your civilizations advantages by allowing you to upgrade your ships, as I just mentioned, as well as building new structures or just making you more efficient in other areas of the game. All in all, there are 24 different technologies, and each time one is researched through science by a player, they will place it on the appropriate row of their player board, marking that they have learned that new technology. Players' populations are represented by color-coded cubes that are initially placed on the 3 resource tracks at the bottom of the player's board, which represent money, science, and materials, all of which are used for very specific purposes in the game. And when a player expands into new sectors of the game board, they may colonize it by moving population cubes to the squares of that sector's hex. And with the leftmost visible number on each track representing how many units of that resource you produce at the end of the round. So what this effectively says is that the more cubes you move to hexes throughout the galaxy, the more resources that your civilization produces. However, all of this is kept in check by the player's influence discs, which are kept at the very bottom of their player board. Influence discs serve two main purposes. First, they are used to mark the hexes in the galaxy that your civilization controls, and therefore where you can actually have population cubes on the board. However, there is a second purpose, and that is to allow players to take as many of the 6 available actions that they so desire each and every turn. Once again, these markers are also on a numbered track though, with the leftmost visible circle depicting how much money that player must pay back at the end of the round to keep their civilization functioning. Thus, the more hexes that a player controls and the more actions that they take every turn, the more money that they will have to spend in order to function properly at the end of the round. Changing pace, players will next need to set up the supply board, which acts as sort of a common hub or marketplace where players will both be purchasing upgrades for their own use as well as filling the galaxy with specific designated markers. On this board, first players will place a random number of researchable technologies that is dependent upon the number of players participating, adding new technologies at the end of each of the game's 9 total rounds. Below that, players will stack and arrange the 17 different ship upgrade parts that can be acquired through the upgrade action once players have learnt the corresponding technology. So in other words, players must always first research a technology into their tech tree before they can take advantage of the corresponding ship parts. Also on the supply board, there are areas for numerous other gameplay tokens, including NPC ships, discovery tokens, orbitals, monoliths, and damage markers that are used for combat. Again, all of which will come into play at various times throughout the game. The actual play area, or galaxy itself, is made up of a completely modular game board that is divided into an imaginary hexagonal grid consisting of a central galactic hex and defense platform, as well as each player's starting hex tile that's both populated and starts 2 hexes away from the center. Now, any hex that you see in the game can be broken down and explained by pointing out just a couple of key features, including the influence circle, where players will place their discs in order to control that hex, victory point values that the hex is worth if controlled at the end of the game, color-coded population squares that players may colonize if they control in order to gain those specific resources, and finally wormholes at their edges that show where players can connect to other hexes in order to both travel and explore. Once the players have set up the boards and galaxy as you see here, they will next mark their starting resource values along the sides of their player boards and place 1 interceptor miniature on their starting tile, signifying the start of the game. A game of Eclipse takes place over 9 total rounds, with each round comprised of 4 individual phases, being the action phase, combat phase, upkeep phase, and cleanup phase. Each of these 4 phases occur in that particular order and produce a minimal amount of downtime, since 2 of these phases occur simultaneously for all the players, while the other 2 take very little to no time to complete or resolve from one player to the next. During the action phase, beginning with the start player and moving clockwise around the table, each player may take 1 action by moving the rightmost influence disc from their influence track to one of the 6 available actions on their player board, even choosing the same action multiple times in a round if they so desire. Players will continue taking actions in this manner around the table one at a time until all the players have decided to pass, which is denoted by the passing player flipping their summary card to their dark sides, with the first player who passes in a turn becoming the starting player on the following round, which becomes very strategically important as the game progresses. Passing, though, does not completely alleviate a player from further participating in that round, though, as they are still allowed to take 1 of the 3 basic reactions that are listed on the back of their summary card, although at reduced benefits from their normal action payoffs, which does come in very handy when defending against other aggressive civilizations. Now, once again, although players may take as many actions as they desire in a round, which certainly has its advantages, the more actions that a player takes, the more upkeep that they must pay at the end of that round. Speaking of actions, there are 6 total actions that a player may take, and I'll very briefly go over each of them. These 6 actions include the following. A player may explore by searching for uncharted sectors in the galaxy that are adjacent to their colony ships. They may influence a sector by either conquering or withdrawing from an unclaimed hex or one that they currently occupy. They may research and develop new technologies by expending the required amount of stockpiled science. They may upgrade or modify their ships by installing ship parts according to the technologies that they have researched. They may build new ships and or structures by expending stockpiled materials, and they may move their ships throughout the galaxy to both explore and initiate combat with MP ships and other civilizations. Once the players have all passed, the combat phase will take place, where battles will be resolved in all the hexes that are occupied by more than one civilization or NPC, with the goal being to capture new sectors for victory points and population expansion, as well as gaining reputation that factors into the player's final score at the end of the game. Now, unfortunately, I'm not going to explain combat here due to time, but I will tell you that it is relatively quick to play out and is resolved solely by dice. However, it's not completely luck driven, as players who have spent their actions and resources to research and modify their ships with targeting computers, shields, expanded hulls, and extra weaponry will almost certainly prevail in ship-to-ship combat, which really creates a wonderful thematic background that completely supports the game's design. Once combat is resolved, players will simultaneously take part in both the upkeep and cleanup phase, which requires players to pay their upkeep costs by expending income from their stockpiled amounts, as well as collect science and materials according to the highest values that are shown on their population tracks. Finally, players will place nuke technologies that can be researched onto the supply board and return any influence disks from their action spaces back onto their influence track in preparation for the following round. As I said during the introduction, I could have spent an hour on this game explaining all the different nuances that make this such a spectacular game. And to be honest, I really haven't even scratched the surface of many of the gameplay features that factor into the overall experience, including ambassadors and diplomacy, wormhole generators, discovery tokens, the trading of goods, structures, alien species, and combat as it affects the greater scope of a civilization's objectives. And for that I apologize, but what's important to take out of all this is that despite all of these numerous interlocking mechanics and components, Eclipse remains a very simple and intuitive game to understand, as well as one that allows players the ability to build their empires to their own liking by providing them with a wealth of different options to partake in, including the pursuit of military domination, peaceful negotiation and expansion, technological supremacy, or even structural creation, all of which will turn into victory points for the players at the end of the game. It's not often that I find a game that I feel is pretty flawless right out of the gate, but for me, Eclipse is just about as good as it gets. It's incredibly well designed, very balanced, but strategic enough to allow players the opportunity to pursue victory in a multitude of different ways, but never rigid enough to lock any one player into a set direction without the opportunity for them to effectively change course midway through the game. And although there is some luck in the game, it is kept in check by allowing players to change their fate through careful planning and researching of technologies, throwing the odds back into their favor. This is definitely one of, if not the best game that I have played in 2011. So that is Eclipse. I am Jeremy Salinas, and thank you very much for watching.